beautiful friends, and welcome back to another video. I hope you've been keeping very well and you are having a beautiful week so far. Today I'm spending the day in the kitchen and doing some delicious vegan meal prep, and I'm so excited to share everything that I'm meal prepping today with you. For breakfast this week, I am bringing you two options. We've got one sweet, which is a lemon and vanilla overnight oats, as well as a savory option, which is this super delicious corn and sun-dried tomato vegan frittata. For lunches and dinners, we're going to make a kale pesto pasta, as well as a pumpkin and quinoa nourish bowl, followed by a peanut butter tofu and greens bowl. And then of course I love to make a sweet treat, and so today I'm going to make some of my Choc peanut butter crunch fudge protein bars. They don't have a full proper name, but they are delicious, so I'm looking forward to sharing those with you today as well. Anyway, there is much to be cooked today, so let's get straight on into it. And of course, we're going to start with these two delicious breakfast options. As I get into this voiceover, I feel I need to give you a little bit of a disclaimer that we are having a massive downpour of rain here today. So I hope the rain in the background isn't too distracting and perhaps adds to the experience of the voiceover instead. Now, when it comes to these overnight oats, into a bowl, I add oats, vanilla protein powder, soy milk, soy yogurt, lemon zest, and lemon juice. And then I whisk this together until it is nice and smooth. Then into a dry pan over the stove, I add in some flaked almonds on medium heat, and I toast these until they begin to get nice and golden. Then when it comes to the fruit, you can really mix up what fruit you would like to have with your overnight oats. As always, I always encourage you to really vary the recipes that I share based on what you like and your personal preference. I decided to slice up some strawberries, and then I put these on top of the overnight oats that I separated into a few different jars, and I also topped these with some flaked almonds before putting them into the fridge to set. And then moving on to this vegan frittata, which is like my new pride and joy of a recipe, just an FYI. I start by slicing up some brown onion, and then I also remove all of the kernels from this corn cob. Now, I feel like this is always a messy experience. If anyone has any tips on how to do this more gracefully, please let me know. But I removed all of the corn kernels, and then I added these with the onion into a pan with a little bit of olive oil and fried this up for about 5 minutes. Then once they started to brown lightly, I'm then going to add in the sun-dried tomatoes. Again, with this recipe, you can mix up what veggies you want to put in here as well, but I do love this combo so much. From here, we're going to move into making the batter, and the base of this is some silken tofu. I also then add in some soy milk as well as some nutritional yeast, then also adding some chickpea flour as well as some veggie stock powder, putting the lid on to my food processor and blitzing this until smooth. You may need to add in some extra soy milk depending on your food processor, and then I transfer this into a mixing bowl, add in that corn, onion, sun-dried tomato mixture, as well as a whole heap of fresh spinach, and then I mix this together until everything is nice and well combined. From here, I'm then going to transfer this into a baking dish, which I had lined, and I'm going to spread it out nice and evenly before putting it into the oven to bake, and all of those details are in the description below. Once it had cooled down, I removed it from the tin, and then I cut it into 6 relatively even sized pieces. I like to put these with a little bit of baking paper on the bottom of each one, and then stack them into a container so they're a nice little grab and go breakfast in the morning. I really like having one of these with just like a side of fruit in the morning, and it's a nourishing and delicious way to start the day. Okay, I'm about to get into making the lunches and the dinners, but before I do, I want to say a big thank you to my friends at Squarespace for very kindly sponsoring this video. You may already know by now how much I love Squarespace. I've been a paying customer of theirs for over 5 years now, and I host and design my own website, amandadux.com, using Squarespace. It is the all-in-one platform to be able to grow and market your business, and there's so much you can do with Squarespace, which is exactly why I love it. Not only can you have a website that showcases everything that your business does, you can also sell products and services, create blog posts, send out email marketing campaigns or newsletters like I do, and it's all done so simply and easily. Me, as someone who doesn't have any experience with design in any capacity, I've been able to create the website myself using Squarespace's design intelligence. If you're ever looking to host or design your own website, I can't recommend Squarespace enough. You can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, you can go to squarespace.com/AmandaDux, and you can use my code, which is AmandaDux. It gets you 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. I've made this like kale cashew pesto pasta for a few people recently, and they've all been blown away by how good it is, and I kind of am as well, because it's literally so filled with nourishment. Once again, you can mix up the veggies that you would like to use here, but personally I like starting with some broccolini as well as some cherry tomatoes. I add these onto a baking tray, and then I'm going to spread them out evenly, drizzling with some olive oil as well as some salt, and then put these into the oven to roast. Meanwhile, I've got some water boiling, and I'm also going to fry up some onion and some garlic in a little bit of olive oil just for a few minutes, and then we are going to get to making the rest of the sauce. These onions and garlic, they're gonna go in the sauce. Anyway, into my food processor, I add some raw cashews as well as some spinach and some kale. Then I'm also adding in that fried onion and garlic, some nutritional yeast as well as some veggie stock powder. I'm also adding in some olive oil followed by some water. Once again, the amount of water that you need will vary based on your food processor or blender that you're using, so just keep that in mind. I blend this together until it's relatively smooth. It doesn't need to be perfectly smooth because it is pesto inspired, even though it's really nothing like a pesto in any capacity. And meanwhile, I am also cooking some pasta. Once the pasta had cooked, I left a little bit of the pasta water in there, and then I'm adding in that sauce and mixing this together well on a low heat, allowing the sauce to thicken up. Of course, it's then time to split this all up into a few containers, and then I add those roasted broccolini and cherry tomatoes on top, as well as some tofu feta that I had in the fridge, and then put these in the fridge to enjoy throughout the week. Moving on to my pumpkin and quinoa nourish bowls, and I start by removing the skin and the seeds from some pumpkin and cutting this into rough chunks. I'm also once again using some cherry tomatoes, which we're also going to roast. I half them, and then into a bowl I add some olive oil, veggie stock powder, smoked paprika, and some black pepper. I mix this together and then add in the pumpkin and the cherry tomatoes, tossing this well until it's all nice and well coated, and then I am transferring this onto a baking tray, spreading it out evenly, and putting this into the oven to roast. Then, of course, we're moving on to the rest of the dish, and something that we need for this dish is a sauce. I'm adding some tahini, some maple syrup, some rice wine vinegar, and some harissa paste, as well as some water to thin it out, into a bowl, and mixing this together until it is nice and smooth. Then we're moving on to the rest of the veggies, and I'm using some leek here, which I cut roughly into pieces, and this really needed to be washed. Leek really needs to be washed thoroughly. So I did so, and once that was washed, I also opened a can of chickpeas, and then I added this with the leek to drain and rinse the chickpeas as well. So then I'm pulling out this pumpkin and cherry tomatoes, and I'm adding the leek and the chickpeas, tossing this together well before putting it back into the oven to continue baking. Of course, we need to cook some quinoa for the quinoa and pumpkin bowls, so I just did this as per the packet instructions, and once that was all done, we got into assembling these bowls. So I start with a bed of the cooked quinoa on the bottom, then I am piling on roast veggies onto all of the quinoa, and then of course I am drizzling these with the delicious creamy tahini harissa sauce and sprinkling with some fresh parsley before putting the lids on and putting these in the fridge to also enjoy throughout the week. Next up, we have my peanut, tofu and greens bowls, and you may have seen me make a variation of this many times throughout my YouTube career, and it's a staple for a reason, because I love it and I really don't get sick of it. So I tore the tofu into chunks and added that into a bowl with some corn flour and some vegan chicken stock powder. Toss that together well, and then put onto a baking tray, drizzled with some oil, and put that into the oven to bake. Of course, we then need to move on to the greens part of the peanut, tofu and greens bowl, and I'm using some broccolini and some green beans here, but once again I encourage you to use what veggies you enjoy. Into a frying pan I then added in some vegan butter, and once that was melted I added in a whole lot of garlic. I crushed this and then fried it up lightly before adding in all of the greens to fry up in this gorgeous garlic butter. So I fried this up for about 7 to 8 minutes until they are cooking but they still have a nice crunch to them before getting into cooking the rice, which once again I did as per the packet instructions. Then we need a peanut sauce for the peanut, tofu and greens bowls, so I add some smooth peanut butter, soy sauce, rice wine vinegar and water into a bowl, and I whisk this together until it is nice and smooth. Then I add in that baked tofu, which is so nice and crispy at this point. I toss it well to get it nice and well coated, and then it's time to get into assembling these bowls. So I put a bed of cooked rice in there, followed by a whole heap of those gorgeous garlic greens. Then I'm adding in that peanut tofu and of course drizzling some extra peanut sauce over the top, also topping with some dried shallots. Put the lids on, put them in the fridge, and I've also got those to enjoy throughout the week. Now we know that I love to have a sweet treat for the afternoon, so of course we're making one for the week, and this almond meal just, it didn't want to come out of the jar, and then it really wanted to come out of the jar. So we're starting with some almond meal as well as some vanilla protein powder. Then I'm also adding in some cocoa powder as well as some soy protein crisps, and I am going to mix this together until it's all nice and well combined. Then of course I need to get into adding the wet ingredients. So these are some Choc peanut bites. I'm using a whole heap of smooth peanut butter as well as some maple syrup, and then I'm mixing this together until a nice dough begins to form. You want it to be on the wet side more than the dry side. Then into a bowl I added in a whole heap of dark chocolate, put that into the microwave to melt, and once it was all melted I'm adding in more of those soy protein crisps, and I'm mixing this together until it's also nice and well combined. Of course we then need to get into assembling these Choc fudge crunch protein bars, if that's what we're calling them, and I spread out that dough evenly into a baking dish before adding on the chocolate mixture and also spreading that out evenly. I then sprinkled it with a little bit of salt and put that into the fridge to set for about an hour. Once it was all set, I then removed it from the baking paper, and I'm going to cut this into some even protein squares, whatever size you would prefer, and then I'm going to put these into the fridge to enjoy as a sweet treat throughout the week. And that is the end of all the meal prep that I did, and I hope you enjoyed. If you tried these recipes, make sure to let me know, and as always, thanks for being here, and I'll see you next week in next week's video. Bye!